Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar. It's especially pleasurable for me to welcome Professor Daniel Gordis, who has joined us. Dr. Gordis is Senior Vice President, Correct Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College in Jerusalem. That's Israel's first liberal arts college. You read him everywhere. He's in Bloomberg Opinion, in the Jerusalem Post. Recently, we read him in the New York Times. He is the author of numerous books. Of special interest to us is his Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. He also wrote a biography of Menachem Begin, and with my predecessor here at the Schusterman Center, Professor David Ellenson, he wrote a different kind of book, which I recommend, entitled Pledges of Jewish Allegiance, Conversion Law and Policymaking in 19th and 20th Century Orthodox Responsa. We're here this afternoon to discuss Dr. Gordis's most recent book entitled We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel. He's going to speak about the book for 45 minutes. And then we will open it up for questions. Let me just make sure that everyone can hear. No difficulties? No, okay, that's good. If a question occurs to you that you would like to ask, or you would like us to ask Dr. Gordis, use the chat function on the bottom of your screen to send that question along. I'm also going to ask now that everybody turn off their telephones, close surrounding doors. Please don't share your screens, mute your microphone. If you get to ask the question, you'll be able to unmute. But if you mute your microphone, everybody will be able to hear properly. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Daniel Gordis.
Thank you, Professor Sarna. It's an honor to be back at the Schusterman Center. Had occasion to be here on numerous occasions when Professor Ellenson was responsible for the center, and I'm grateful to everybody who has signed on today to be part of this conversation. So I'll say a brief couple of words about the genesis of the book, why the book came to be written in the first place, and then give you kind of a thesis, a basic thesis of the book. I'll actually mention what I think are the more controversial parts of the book and the issues that some of the reviewers have pointed to, and then we'll open it up and have a conversation. So as Jonathan was kind enough to mention, I put out a book which is a one-volume history of Israel some time ago, I guess about 3 years ago. And one of the interesting things that happened as a result of the book was that I got a lot of emails, not dozens, but probably hundreds of emails from people who said something very similar amongst themselves. They said basically, I learned something, and I either enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, whatever, but it was a fairly sympathetic reading of Israel. There were things that you obviously were critical of, but it's a basically sympathetic view of Israel. And so the question that I have, these people wrote me and said was, so then if that's the case, if it was so sympathetic, and I basically liked the argument, then why am I still left with this complicated feeling in my gut about Israel? How come I actually buy the fairly sympathetic story, and yet there's something about Israel that strikes me as problematic or that I don't feel comfortable with, and so on and so forth. And That struck me as a really important question, particularly because so many people had asked it. So I began to ask myself, really, what was the issue? And this book is more or less the product of the thinking that I did as a result of those questions. And what I want to try to do now is give you a sense of a couple of things. Number one, we'll start with what's the conventional wisdom? What's the conventional wisdom that people use when they want to express why do American Jews and Israelis have such issues with each other? Particularly, why do American Jews have such issues with Israelis? But not only, the other direction matters as well. Then I want to tell you why I think the conventional wisdom has to be wrong. And then finally, I'll give you my take on, instead of the conventional wisdom, what my explanation for part of this complicated relationship is. Again, the complicated relationship, by the way, is not a way of saying that this side is right or that side is right. I kind of tried to take a very neutral tone in the whole book. And since I use the metaphor of a couple that is, quarreling all the time, several times in the book, what I'll say is, I kind of assumed the position of the therapist. It wasn't my job to say, you're right or you're right, but it was my job to say, do you hear how he or she is seeing it? And do you hear how he or she is seeing it? And do you understand why just simply your two different ways of looking at this are creating the blow up? Far be it from me to say you're right or you're wrong. Just can we help understand where the other is coming from? So what I'm going to try to do in the third part, again, is not suggest that there's a right or a wrong here, because I really don't think that there is. What I think is that there are two very, very different communities, and those differences, which we really never talk about for good reasons, which I'll come to also, are kind of bubbling below the surface, like in any relationship, right? If you have big underlying issues below the surface that never get addressed, then smaller things are going to cause explosions. And I don't want to suggest, by the way, that the things that cause explosions here are small. They're not. They're huge. But I still don't think that they are the major reason for the complicated relationship between American Jews and Israel. So let me start out with the conventional wisdom and then tell you why I think the conventional wisdom, almost by definition, has to be wrong. Here's the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that Israelis and Americans, American Jews obviously, fight with each other over issues having to do more or less with contemporary Israeli policy. In other words, the two big issues, and there are more, but the two big issues are obviously the conflict, and more specifically, the conflict with the Palestinians, and more specifically than that, the occupation of Palestinians on the West Bank and to a certain extent in Gaza as well. And the argument goes that Israel has been occupying the West Bank for 50 years, it's a half a century. America has made peace with Japan. America has made peace with Germany. America has made peace with parts of Korea. America has put lots of old conflicts to bed. How is it that a country the size of New Jersey, fighting over a space more or less the size of somebody's backyard in the Hamptons, more or less, can't really work this out? There's got to be something. It's got to be solvable. And since Israel has many of the cards in its hand, goes the argument, Israel should be the one that's more magnanimous, make sure that this conflict gets ended, and so on and so forth. So the conflict and the occupation are the most obvious issue. And then a second runner-up, which is a very close second, is the undeniably horrifying way in which Israel's religious leadership, and sometimes its political leadership, but certainly its religious leadership, all too often speak about non-Orthodox Judaism, especially in America. Important to remember that only 20-ish% of Israelis are observant in any kind of rigorous way, which you would call, Orthodox or whatever. But for the vast majority of them, the default understanding of what Judaism is Orthodox Judaism. The Judaism that they may choose not to belong to or not to participate in is an Orthodox Judaism. They don't really know very much about these other denominations, which are small in Israel and tend to be located in certain cities and tend to be more a function of Anglo immigrants and so on and so forth. And so Israel's religious and sometimes political leadership is very derisive of American non-Orthodox forms of Judaism in a way that I personally find reprehensible. And again, without suggesting that it's not reprehensible and without suggesting in any way that it's not a huge issue, I don't really think, though, that that's the real reason for the regular blowups that we have between these two communities. There are other issues, things that Israel does that strike many American Jews as being distinctly non-democratic. For example, when Israel passes a nation-state law that says it's the nation-state of the Jewish people, American Jews want to know, well, you have 20% Arab minority. 20% is not exactly negligible. How are they supposed to feel when the country declares itself a Jewish nation state? The nation state law, which made Hebrew the official language and Arabic an honored language, but not the official language, and so on and so forth. That strikes many American Jews as distinctly problematic. Certainly not the way an American democracy would comport itself. Why would a Jewish democracy comport itself that way? Or when Bibi Netanyahu periodically makes these claims that he wants to get rid of a certain percentage of the asylum seekers who have made their way into Israel over the course of the past decades. And about a year ago, give or take, wanted to get rid of about 40,000 people who would come in illegally. Israelis were up in arms. My wife and I were in the counter demonstrations in Tel Aviv alongside the asylum seekers themselves, which was a very moving experience for us. But again, American Jews look at this and just want to know, how does a democracy think about deporting people? Now, by the way, that's gotten more complicated since America's policies with ICE has changed a little bit also. But again, American Jews obviously are by and large not in favor of these changed policies and look askance at what Israel does. So there are other issues also, but mainly the occupation, mainly Israel's very dismissive, sometimes, attitude towards non-Orthodox Judaism, and then other issues like the nation-state law, asylum seekers, and so on and so forth. That's the conventional wisdom. American Jews just don't like what Israel does, and if Israel stopped doing these things, the relationship would get much better. Would it be perfect? Probably not. Very few relationships in life are perfect, but it would probably get much better. Now, how do I know, or why do I think at least, that conventional wisdom about the argument or the conflict or the fraught relationship, why do I think that it is wrong? The reason that I think it is wrong is because the relationship was problematic before there was a Jewish state. In other words, the relationship was problematic before there was an occupation. The relationship was problematic back in the days when Israel's rabbinate didn't waste time talking about non-Israeli Jews because they had plenty of other things to worry about in the still forming Jewish state. They just didn't reflect on American Judaism at all. And I'll just give you 3 or 4 examples. We'll see how the time goes, of ways in which this kind of explodes periodically in American Jewish life. And then has obviously nothing to do with the conflict, nothing to do with Orthodox rabbinate and non-Orthodox Jews, and it predates all of those things. So let's go 3 examples just for the sake of time right now. The first example that I think it's good to point to is the big battle between Louis Brandeis and Chaim Weizmann in the summer of 1921. Right now, 1921, we are still a quarter of a century, more than a quarter of a century prior to the creation of the Jewish state. And already there are enormous tensions between American Zionists and European Zionists. And Louis Brandeis, who was by that point already on the Supreme Court, and so was a larger-than-life figure in American Jewish life, the first Jew to be appointed to the Supreme Court, obviously an unbelievably brilliant jurist, and a Zionist too. And he had, because World War I had created a kind of sidelined much of Europe, a European Jewry was unable to do all of the work that it had wanted to do because Europe was in flames during the war. American Zionism kind of filled that vacuum to a certain extent, and Louis Brandeis finds himself more or less the titular head of the Zionist movement in the late teens and 1920, 21, etc. Louis Brandeis, for reasons we're going to come back to later, says all kinds of things. We should support Zionism. Why? He actually says this, because it will make us better Americans. He says we should support Zionism even though none of us or our children would ever consider of moving to that place. It's still a good thing to support. And what happens is European Zionists look at this and say, you should support Zionism because it'll make you better Americans. That's not at all what Zionism is about. It has nothing to do with being Americans. And what do you mean you would never move to this place? The whole idea of creating this, whatever it's going to be, a state, a sovereign entity of some other sort, is that we're going to move there. So what are you exactly talking about? And I'll come back to why Brandeis was saying what he was saying in a little bit. But Europeans look at this with horror. And Chaim Weizmann actually refers to Louis Brandeis and all of his writings on Zionism and calls it Yankee Doodle Judaism. In other words, some sort of not serious, not intellectually sophisticated, distinctly American form of Zionism that, frankly, Chaim Weizmann has no use for whatsoever. And in the summer of 1921, we'll condense this story very quickly. In the summer of 1921, Weizmann actually flies to the States. There's a big battle inside the the World Zionist movement, and Weizmann actually emerges victorious. And Louis Brandeis is more or less sidelined. That's why there's many people, including many American Jews, who know a lot about Louis Brandeis and his being on the court and so forth, who actually are not aware that for a certain period, he was running the International Zionist movement. But he loses the battle in 1921. There's a big battle, as I said, between Europeans and Americans, nothing to do with the occupation, nothing to do with reform or conservative Judaism. There's a battle there brewing. Already we'll come back to what it really was. Let's now fast forward a quarter of a century, a few years more than that. Israel gets created. The UN votes in 1947. Israel's created in 1948. And by 1950, 51, Ben-Gurion, who's the prime minister, obviously, is coming to America with some regularity and is telling Americans that there is a now new Jewish center there's a new center of the Jewish world. It's in Israel. And American Jews are very puzzled by this claim that Israel is the new center of the Jewish world. And they point out to him, actually, there's more Jews in New York City than in your entire country. So what exactly are you talking about? And then they say, with less humor and less of a twinkle in their eye, it's also not only incorrect, it's an affront. In other words, you're not a new center. There is a Jewish state. The vast majority of the world's Jews live in America. After the Second World War obviously eviscerates a European Jewry, the vast majority of the world's Jews live in America. There's a small fraction of that number that lives in Israel. What are you actually talking about? And this leads to an enormous brouhaha, especially with a guy named Jacob Blaustein, who was the head of the American Jewish Committee at that time. The American Jewish Committee at that time, it's very, very different now, completely different now. But back in those days, number one, it was really the American Jewish institution that spoke for the American Jewish community, not officially, but de facto. And it had two large political camps. One was the anti-Zionist camp, and one was the non-Zionist camp. There was a sliver that was Zionist, but the AJC was effectively divided between the anti-Zionists and the non-Zionists, the latter group of which Jacob Blaustein was part. And Blaustein and Ben-Gurion really come to blows in 1950, 1951. And Dr. Sarna has written about this a lot. It's in his book on American Judaism, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, at a certain point, Blaustein informs the board of directors of the AJC that he and Ben-Gurion have reached a kind of an understanding. And he has explained to Ben-Gurion that Ben-Gurion has to cease and desist. He can no longer speak about Israel as the center of the Jewish world because it's not. And American Jews are committed to America, not to Israel, in terms of where they want to live, where they want their children to live, where they expect their grandchildren are going to live. They will support Israel, says Blaustein, and this is very important. Very important to understand. They will support Israel because they said Israel, or a sovereign Jewish entity, this is what Blaustein says, is the best possible solution to the problem of hundreds of thousands of Jewish displaced persons in Europe. Meaning, we want them to not have to come here. We want them to have a place to go. A sovereign Jewish state is the answer to that. Now, to Zionists, you have to understand what that sounds like. This had nothing to do with 2,000 years of Jewish yearning and the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty on the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. It was not about creating a society that would be suffused with Jewish values and would be based on Jewish texts, and where the Supreme Court would combine British law and Jewish law and so on and so forth. All of those things which Zionists thought was the ultimate triumph of Zionism, American Jews in the form of Blaustein are saying, we don't care about that. We just want a place for these displaced persons to go. And it leads, as I said, to this brouhaha. And finally, Blaustein and Ben-Gurion more or less agree. Ben-Gurion will stop telling American Jews that Israel's the center of the Jewish world, and he will stop urging American Jews to make Aliyah. And in return, American Jews will give Israel financial and political support in America. Ben-Gurion, who did not pray 3 times a day, instead violated that agreement 3 times a day, so that there would be at least some continuity with Jewish tradition, I guess. But he did not actually uphold his part of the bargain, and Blaustein periodically got infuriated. But American Jews did live up to their side, and they gave Israel tremendous support, both politically and financially, and have continued to do so really ever since then. So 1921, a huge battle between Brandeis and Weizmann. 1950-51, a battle between Blaustein and Ben-Gurion. One more, 1960, a rumor spreads in Jerusalem and then in the Knesset that Ben-Gurion is going to come to the Knesset and he has an unbelievably important announcement to make. Nobody knows what the announcement is, but he has an important announcement to make. And for those people who kept diaries and wrote about that day, This is the old Knesset building on the corner of King George and Ben Yehuda, more or less. You walk up the street on Ben Yehuda, you hit King George, you turn left for about 50 yards, and across the street, there's a building that's now being refurbished. That was the Knesset building until 1969. That's the building. Don't imagine the Knesset where it is now. Imagine the older building. The plenum is completely filled, packed, and nobody knows what he's going to do. But there's not room to maneuver in the Knesset. And Ben Gurion walks in, and he basically says, I won't read you the whole thing, but he basically says, I'm here to announce that Israel has captured the highest ranking Nazi criminal that we know of in the world in Argentina, obviously Adolf Eichmann. He has been spirited out of Argentina, and he is now in Israel, where he is going to stand trial for genocide against the Jews. And with that, Ben Gurion turns and walks out of the room. And the people who were there that day wrote in their diaries that it was silent in the chamber, just silent. And you have to remember, of course, to understand that what percentage of the people in that room, both the members of Knesset and those who were not members of Knesset, what percentage of them had lost family to Eichmann and his co-committers of genocide? There was a deep sense of satisfaction. It meant that now that there was a Jewish state, you could not commit genocide against the Jewish people and live out your life in placidity somewhere else. The long arm of the Jewish state and the long arm of the Jewish people was going to find you wherever you were. And Israel, of course, has done that time and time again. It went ahead, as many of you probably know, after the Munich attacks in 1973, Israel, over the course of the upcoming years, found every single one of those terrorists and killed them. Some of them in this country, some of them in that country. People might say that, that's a kind of a violation of other countries' sovereignty, and Argentina certainly claimed that Israel had violated its sovereignty by sending agents into Argentina, kidnapping somebody, whisking him out of Argentina, etc. But Jews in Israel didn't really care what Argentina thought. For them, Jewish statehood meant you can't kill millions of Jews and then live out your life. That's what Jewish sovereignty means. So there was this deep sense of satisfaction, not celebration by any means, but a deep sense of satisfaction in the Knesset that day. And then spontaneously, from those people, again, who took notes and wrote about it in their diary, the whole burst into seemingly endless applause. Again, not joyous applause, but applause of deep satisfaction that just basically 12 years into Israel's existence, it had proven you can't hide if you murder millions of Jews. In America, though, there was actually outrage at what Israel had done, even among American Jews. Joseph Proskauer, who was the head of the AJC prior to Blaustein, but who was still very involved and was the head of the anti-Zionist camp, wrote Ben Gurion and said that he had no right to act in the name of an imaginary Jewish identity or an imaginary Jewish ethnicity. In other words, Jews are a religion, he was saying, but by virtue of what do you do this? Don't forget. And he said this, many people said this. Eichmann didn't kill any Israelis. Eichmann was, quote unquote, out of business, and I don't use that term lightly, obviously. Eichmann stopped doing what he did in 1945. Israel's created in 1948. So by virtue of what does Israel see itself as the representative of Jewish people across the world? By virtue of what, say American Jews, do you go find Eichmann when he also killed my ancestors? But you don't represent me. And it led to an unbelievable blow up. I won't give you all the various quotes by American Jews who said all kinds of crazy things. Ethan Fromm, for example, who was a well-known American Jew, actually said, believe it or not, that what Israel had done to Eichmann was no better than what Eichmann had done to the Jews. That's a kind of a strange thing to say, but that's what he said. In any event, Ben Gurion is apoplectic with rage at American Jews. And in December of 1960, at the 25th Zionist Congress, he actually gives a speech in which he says that American Jews are going to disappear in a sea of irrelevance and assimilation. Until his dying day, that is what he believed. He never changed his mind. And I only point that out because it's important for us to remember that this is not Bibi Netanyahu talking. And this is not Ariel Sharon. This is David Ben Gurion, the socialist, liberal, leftist, beloved of American Jews, who said publicly in 1960, it's over in America. The Jews in America are going to disappear into a sea of assimilation. Now, so far he's been proven wrong, although obviously there's huge debates both in America and outside. How is American Judaism doing? An entirely different topic. But American Jews needed to remember that in 1960, Ben Gurion says exactly the same kind of things that Bibi Netanyahu says. Everybody just imagines that it's Bibi Netanyahu because we don't remember our history from 70 years ago or 60 years ago. But it's important to remember. So 1921, 1950, 1960, these are all examples, excuse me. These are all examples of cases in which American Jews in Israel have huge blowups, threaten to walk away from each other. That has nothing to do with Palestinians. There's no occupation. The Orthodox rabbinate's not talking about American Jews. We're decades away from that. That's why it seems to me the cause or the conventional wisdom about the cause of the fraught relationship simply really can't be right. If that's the case, and again, not everybody agrees with me, and some of the reviews have actually said that, the evidence that I adduced to argue that this argument is so old doesn't necessarily mean that the conventional wisdom isn't correct. That's a fair argument. I obviously disagree with the disagreement, but I think it's a perfectly fair question to raise. But in the book, what do I basically say, therefore, is the real reason for the divide between American Jews and Israel? And I'll try to do this very quickly. I'll give 3 or 4 quick bullet points, each of which is a much larger part of the book itself. But the bottom line argument in the book is that the forms of Judaism that have grown up or have developed in American and Israel are fundamentally radically different kinds of Judaism. Not better, not worse, not good, not bad, not stronger, not less strong, just radically different kinds of Judaism. Don't forget that in 1880, which was, everybody thinks that was a long, long, long time ago. It actually wasn't. In other words, my grandfather, with whom I spent many, many years studying Talmud on a regular basis, he was born in 1908. So his father, I'm assuming, was born in around 1880, give or take. So, it wasn't all that long ago. The father of the person who taught me Talmud more than anybody else was alive in 1880. He really, and I'm not as old as you think. So in any event, it's not a crazy long time ago. It's 130 years ago. 130 years ago, 140 years ago almost, the combined Jewish population of the United States and what was then called Palestine is 275,000 people, which accounts for 3% of the world's Jews. 3%. Today, those two communities, the United States and Israel, account for about 85, 86% of the world's Jews. Meaning that the two communities that make up the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the world's Jews are very new communities relative to a people that sees itself as 4, 3, 2,000 years old, depending on how you want to define the beginning of the Jewish people. So these are two very new communities, and they grew up in response to very different kinds of settings, to very different kinds of challenges, and so on and so forth. What's America fundamentally? I would argue that America, not Israel, not American Judaism, just America at the moment. America is, if you want to think about Emma Lazarus and her poem, The Colossus at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, you're teeming masses yearning to breathe free. America is about tired, poor, hungry people who want to breathe free. Not white people, not Christian people, not European people, just people. And the argument was that if you want to make yourself part of this extraordinary American experiment, be part of this. We're open to everybody. America is a radical experiment in a new form of human self-government. And if you want to be part of this, we welcome you in. And by the way, it's important to recognize while America has been far from perfect in this, America has lived up to that promise for millions and millions and millions of people. Right? When my grandmother came into the United States in Ellis Island in 1908, I think it was, if you had asked her, if she was a little girl, but let's just say that she wasn't, let's say she was 20 when she came in and she'd been an adult and able to think, and you'd said to her, it's now 1908, what's American Judaism going to look like in 2008, 100 years later? In her wildest imagination, she wouldn't have imagined what American Jews would be like. The Italians who came into America at that time didn't imagine what would happen to Italian Americans or whatever. America lived up to that promise, not for everybody, but for many, many millions of people, and for the Jews especially, it really did fulfill that promise. But in 1915, as Woodrow Wilson is saying to American Jews, among others. If you want to be American, you have to be all in. No Austrian American, no Irish American, no Spanish American. The British are beginning to move towards the direction of the Balfour Declaration, which they're going to issue in 1917. And the Balfour Declaration in 1917 says His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, again, there's a second sentence which is about not discriminating against anybody who's already there. That's 1,000% true. But the purpose of the country, says the Balfour Declaration, it'll be a national home for the Jewish people. That is just not the same thing as give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free. America was an experiment in human self-government not tied to any ethnicity. In fact, it was meant to be ethnicity blind. Israel, the Jewish state that would eventually come from the Balfour Declaration some 30 years later, was meant to be a country that would do one thing. It would save the Jewish people. That was its purpose. America fulfilled its promise, and Israel fulfilled its promise. But one is a radically universalist image and vision of what a country should be, and one is, while it's a democracy, a very particularist definition of what a country should be. And just think about the symbolism. Think about the bald eagle versus the menorah. Think about a flag with stars and stripes, or a flag that's meant to look like a talit. Just that. Or think about, the land of the free and the home of the brave. I mean, what country could not actually sing that line? It could be the national anthem of Sudan or of Japan or of Germany. Land of the free and the home of the brave. A lot of people would say that, as opposed to kol od balevav pnima nefesh Yehudi homia, as long as deep within the soul of the Jew begins the Israeli national anthem. In other words, these are two radically different kinds of countries. We imagine that Israel's kind of supposed to be a small version of America, a kind of Hebrew-speaking, falafel-eating version of the United States in a bad neighborhood. But that, of course, misses the point of Israel altogether. And part of the argument of the book is that American Jews, understandably, by the way, because they've been raised and educated in America, fundamentally think that the ideal form of democracy is this liberal democracy, which is America. And they look at Israel doing all sorts of things that make no sense if you're a liberal democracy, without ever having had the conversation about the fact that Israel's not a liberal democracy. It's an ethnic democracy and was never intended to be a liberal democracy. Give you two other quickies, make one other point, and then I'll open it up for discussion, because I'm sure I'll learn a tremendous amount from your questions, much more than just listening to myself speak. Judaism in America, by and large, becomes a religion. There are Protestants, there are Catholics, there are Jews. There are obviously Muslims now, but back in the 1950s, actually, there was a book called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. Jews were a religion. The Reform Movement's 1885 Pittsburgh platform had very kind of prophetically almost said in 1885, we view ourselves no longer as a people, but just as a religion, and therefore have no intent of returning to Palestine, because religions don't have countries. Where's the Episcopal country? Where's the Methodist country? Where's the Presbyterian country? Religions don't have countries, peoples have countries. The Kurds want a country because they're a people. The Chechens want a country because they're a people. The Basques want a country because they see themselves as a people. If the Jews were a people, you could make an argument. But say American Jews, we no longer see ourselves as a people, we see ourselves as a religion. Whereas in Israel, obviously, many, many, many Jews who are deeply committed to being part of the Jewish people never step foot in a synagogue. Don't do anything for a bar or bat mitzvah that's not a party. We literally, I'm not exaggerating, this is not hyperbolic, this is true. We have students at Shalem College, where I teach, who literally have not put their foot in a synagogue in their entire life. They care deeply about Israel. They care deeply about being Jewish. They're part of the Jewish state. They vote. They stand for the siren. They serve in the army. They are deeply committed, but synagogue stuff and religious stuff has absolutely no significance in their lives whatsoever. One's a religion, one's a form of Judaism based much more on nationality. They're not opposites, but they are very distinctly different kind of instincts. Because of that, by the way, or related to that, I guess, not because of, but related to that, it's also important to remember that American Jews and Israelis live in the world in a very different kind of a way. Again, not good or bad, or right or wrong, or brave or not brave, just very, very different. Saul Bellow, who wrote a book called Humboldt's Gift, wrote at the very beginning of the novel when he's describing this guy, Humboldt, who had come from Crimea and moved to America, the standard Eastern European American Jew. He says of Humboldt that Humboldt, thought that history was a nightmare, and he had come to America to get a good night's rest. which is a great line, which is why you win the Pulitzer and the Nobel for that book. You have enough great lines in a book, you get a big prize. In any event, it's a great book. It's a hard book to read, and a lot of people today find it kind of boring because it's not written in today's style, but it was a great book. But that's a fabulous line. Basically, what he's saying is American Jews don't have a foreign policy. If American Jews vote for whoever they vote for, and that candidate or series of candidates or party has a foreign policy, but American Jews don't have a foreign policy in America. So that if at Abu Ghraib there are Jewish soldiers committing those kinds of horrifying things, that's horrible, but it's not, Abu Ghraib is not a Jewish problem. For those of you that remember your Vietnam history, if there had been Jewish soldiers at My Lai, I don't think there were, but let's say there were. If there had been Jewish soldiers at the town of My Lai where American soldiers committed atrocities, that would have been a horrible thing if there had been Jews there, but it was horrible, period. And even if there had been Jewish soldiers there, it would not have become a Jewish issue. But with Israeli troops on the Gaza border, the same day that the embassy moves from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, kills 60-something Palestinian, mostly teenagers and young adults, that's a Jewish problem. Now, American Jews and Israelis have radically different takes on how Jews should be in history. American Jews were horrified by what happened on the Gaza border. And in fact, the Forward published an article by Peter Beinart, which was not a terribly, I didn't disagree with the article all that much, but I hated the headline, which he did not write. The headline was, and I quote it explicitly, verbatim, Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians should not surprise us, but should still horrify us. Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians. Like commanders woke up one bright sunny morning and said, what should we do today? Oh, I know. I'll take the 19 and 20-year-olds under my command, and I'll tell them to shoot a couple dozen Palestinian kids. Now, if Israelis thought that that is what had happened, why did not a single left-wing Israeli party call for an investigation? Why did not a single left-wing Israeli party call for a vote of no confidence in the government? What, American progressives are more moral than Israeli progressives? Americans care about human life more than Israelis care about human life? I don't think so. I think the issue was that Americans see what happens on the border, understandably again, as more or less a kind of a civil rights issue, and Israel see what happens on the border as a security issue. And they know that Israel has always defended that border with lethal force because it's just a fence. It's not parts of it are sophisticated and parts of it are a wall, but a lot of it's the kind of fence you put up in the suburbs between you and your neighbor's yard. And how do I know that it's a fence? You know it too, because you see in the headlines in Haaretz or Times of Israel or whatever, Israel caught a couple of Palestinian kids that snuck across the fence, picked them up, scooped them up, brought them back to the Gazan side of the border and dropped them off. If it was so impenetrable, how did those kids get across? It's fence. That fence gets pushed down, and then 10, and then 50, and then 100, and then 500 Palestinians come streaming across. There's no way to defend the kibbutzim and the moshavim that are just hundreds of yards away with men and women and children and older people and babies. You can't defend them. So Israel has had a zero tolerance policy of threatening the fence. If you get near the fence and threaten it, Israel has always said, we will unfortunately have to shoot to kill. Now, we can agree or disagree with the policy. I mean, some Israelis don't like the policy either, but Israelis did not erupt in an outrage because they understood that horrible day along the Gaza border as a security day, and Americans saw it as a violation of civil rights of an oppressed people. Again, that's not right or wrong. It's just two radically different ways of looking at this. So time is running short, and I want to wrap up. So I just think that these are kinds of examples of ways, universalist versus particular, religion versus nationality, not having a foreign policy or staying out of the muddiness of human history and getting deeply into the mud and the messiness and the tremendous problematics of having power that being involved in human history always involves. These are just radically different takes on Jewish life. And here's why we never discussed it. At the beginning, we didn't discuss it because it didn't serve either people well. It did not serve American Jews who wanted to support Israel. It didn't serve them well to say, we're a liberal democracy and they're an ethnic democracy. If you were trying to get American Jews to be excited about Israel, what you wanted to do was point to all the ways in which you're similar. And therefore, your American Jews would say, oh my God, the things that we love about America, the Jews are actually now doing in the Middle East. How incredibly awesome is that? There was a disincentive, to be honest, about how very different these things were. By the same token, Israelis who were trying to get support with American presidents and on Capitol Hill, it didn't serve them well to point out how different Israel was from what America was. It didn't point out, it didn't serve them well to say, oh my God, we could never put Emma Lazarus's poem at the bottom of the menorah because we're not about tired, poor, hungry, teeming masses yearning to be free. We're about the Jewish people. How does that get you support on Capitol Hill? It doesn't. So both sides really, I think, had a kind of a vested interest in not talking about the fundamentally different enterprises that these two countries were. We've all been in complicated relationships with friends, with children, with parents, with significant others, et cetera, et cetera. We've all been there. And we all know that if one starts out at a certain point by not talking about the really complex underlying issues in a relationship, at a certain point, it gets almost impossible then to surface them. And then things get very, very complicated. I think that's where we are. I think things are really complicated because for 70 years, American Jews have supported Israel in many, many, many ways. And I think Israel has contributed to American Jewish life in many, many, many ways. But we have never been willing to talk about how radically differently we see the world. And now because we've reached the kind of maturity, and politics in America and in Israel are changing, politics all over the world are obviously changing. We've gotten to a point where things that really do matter, like the conflict, like the rabbinate, like the nation-state law, etc., they threaten not only to create an uproar, they actually threaten to rip apart the relationship. And I wrote the book in the hope that we could engender a conversation about how different we have become. Not that we can then say one's right, one's wrong, one's better, one's worse, one's more Jewish, one's less Jewish, but we could simply say, I see how you see it. I don't agree with you, but I see how you see it. And therefore, when you do things that I don't like, I'm not going to walk away from you because I think that you just, you don't matter or you're terrible, et cetera, et cetera. I want to be in a relationship with you. Let's talk about how we can applaud each other's successes, help each other with the challenges that we face, and see if we can move on. The last sentence that I'll simply say is this. The skies are darkening for the Jewish people, once again. The skies have darkened dramatically in Europe. The skies are darkening in America. None of us know quite how dark the skies will get, and we all hope and pray that they will not get much darker than they have gotten, but they are darkening. And we saw what Iran was able to pull off with Saudi Arabia just a few weeks ago in those oil fields. What if Iran had been able to do that in Israel? Not with oil fields, but with hospitals and with power grids and with bridges. Israel's also vulnerable, not to standing armies, but to all kinds of new technology. The Jewish people, it seems to me, ought not have the hubris of assuming that we're the community that's going to survive and they're going to get wiped out. Or we're the community that's going to survive and they're going to disappear in a sea of assimilation. I think we don't know. And we have to be there for each other and with each other and do what we've always done, which is to care about each other, even if we disagree, because we understand at the end of the day, our destinies are tied one to the other. If the book engenders the kind of conversation that leads us in that direction, then I think the book will have accomplished what I hoped it would do. So I'll stop with that and open it up. And now people who are smarter than me are going to show me what I do here. Okay, and.
All right, well, first of all, I know everybody on the line and everybody who listens afterward joins me in thanking Daniel for this stunning presentation. You may not realize, so I'll reveal that he did all of that without a note. I
did spend some time on the project, and I think you could do the same by American Cities.
But really remarkable. I also want to say that I've read the book and really urge you to read it. It raises very important questions. It opens up issues that need to be discussed about American Jews and Israel, and I think asks and poses some of the issues that cry out for discussion. But now the floor is yours. So if you have questions, we are happy to hear them. If you haven't sent it in writing, feel free just to raise your hand and we'll figure out how to do it.
Well, while you're all thinking of questions, I will simply say that I say this in the acknowledgments, but I'll repeat it here, that one of the first people with whom I had a very, very significant conversation and then who flooded me with things that he'd written about this issue was Professor Sarna. So this is an opportunity to thank him, panim el panim, for his contributions to my thinking about the subject, particularly in early America, but certainly not limited to that.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you.
Question from Gary Gilbert.
Okay, we'll move to Gary Gilbert's question. Yeah. Let me read it. When AIPAC, Gary, do we want to ask Gary just?
No, we'll just read it out loud. We'll do it.
When AIPAC criticizes Israel for denying entry to U.S. members of Congress, how does this action by a very pro-Israel organization fit into your argument? Is this not an example of how the difference is not about principle, but about policy?
Gary, that's a great point. So let's say something about that specific issue of Israel not letting in Tzla'i Ben Omar a couple of weeks ago. I did a program with Thomas Friedman last week or the week before in New York, and he called that decision boneheaded. I think it was actually complimentary relative to what the decision really was. It was an absurd decision. But having said that, I will now explain to you exactly why Bibi Netanyahu did it. Which is not to say I think I like it, but it's why he did it. Bibi Netanyahu, who has his hands full these days, you do not want to trade places with him. He does not sleep well at night. But in any event, Bibi Netanyahu has a very simple policy when it comes to the Trump administration. Do not get on Donald Trump's wrong side. Period. Ever. No matter what it takes. By the way, this happened before the results of the elections, but you could see that the minute it looked like it was close with blue and white, Trump started to distance himself from Bibi. He started to run the other direction. It became very clear that Trump cares about aligning himself with winners, and he cares about himself. Bibi is not stupid. Whatever you want to say about Bibi, he is not at all stupid. He understands that Trump is, let's just say, not a policy wonk, we'll put it that way, is vindictive, is very concerned about himself, and therefore he understood the one thing you do not do is tick off Donald Trump. And Donald Trump tweeted the day before, it would be a sign of great weakness if Israel let them in. My friends who work inside the administration told me that they were going to let them in. And the attitude was this: were they going to go to Yad Vashem? They were not going to go to Yad Vashem. Were they going to go to some public school where Jews and Arabs learn together and then write about that? They were not going to go to that school. Were they going to go only to the West Bank and say all the things that we were afraid that they were going to say? That's exactly what they were going to do. Has it happened before? It's happened before. Did it bring Israel down? It didn't bring Israel down. Would we have survived it? We would have survived it. You take a couple of Advil, you go on. Everybody understood that it was just simply, there was no reason not to let them in. It was going to be annoying and frustrating, but that was the end of it. And they were going to let them in. Netanyahu made a decision when Trump basically in Twitter told him not to, made a decision not to do it. Now, that's why, Gary, I think your excellent question can be answered on the level of that was a policy issue, which says nothing about the issue of principle. As you point out, AIPAC is completely and utterly supportive of Israel, but AIPAC does its work on Capitol Hill. I mean, AIPAC's bottom line job is to create support for the state of Israel on Capitol Hill. The White House is a little bit part of that picture, but fundamentally AIPAC works on Capitol Hill. When Israel dissed two members of Congress by not allowing them into a country, it makes AIPAC's work unbelievably more difficult, because the first question every AIPAC person is going to get in every congressional office is, if you respect this institution, how did you not let two members of Congress in? And so AIPAC really had to distance itself from that boneheaded move, boneheaded but understandable at the same time move, because otherwise it was going to be paralyzed on Capitol Hill. So I think your point's really well taken, but I don't think that specific example is pertinent to this. I think AIPAC said what it had to say, because otherwise it couldn't do its work on Capitol Hill. Trump left Bibi no choice, and Bibi left AIPAC no choice. And everybody did what they had to do to move their own agenda forward. That's the crazy world in which we live. But it's an awesome question, and it's great to point it out. So thanks for that.
Other questions? So let me ask the question. You talk about American Jews and Israel, and fortunately, much more than David Ben-Gurion, you know both of those places, and there's no such thing as American Jewry. And there is a kind of risk that one cites the folks who support your position when Proskauer, who considered the state of Israel one of the greatest tragedies to befall the Jewish people, he was a small minority, and he's actually, although a man who is revered for some of his work in human rights, he's pushed out of the presidency of the committee and more or less from the committee as a whole. And there are polls that suggest that 80% of American Jews in the 1940s actually support a Jewish state. So I guess the question, of course, not all Israelis agree on all matters either. And so in a way I'm asking you, although of course the book is about American Jews and Israel, how does one deal with the obvious fact that all American Jews are not alike, all Israelis are not alike, and you don't give us the percentages here for most cases that allow people to decide, is your example reflective of a broad swath or not?
Obviously, a hugely important issue, and obviously also neither community is monolithic in any way, shape, manner, or form. At the same time, we do speak about the French, we do speak about the Germans, we do speak about the Catholics. We speak about groups by that's essentially how we work. What I do point out in the book is, of course, that you're 1,000% right, that neither community is monolithic. And I also point out in the book that I was specifically not going to get into the statistical issue, because once you get into the statistical issue, you have to then justify the statistics. You have to offer competing statistical analyses. You have to start explaining it. And all of a sudden, the book becomes the kind of a book that is not what I wanted to write, which was a book that, a college student or an adult, who's, much after college, could pick up, say, over Thanksgiving weekend. I'm just going to read this book over the weekend, and at the end of the weekend, I will, have a better understanding, or at least one person's understanding of this. A lot of people have been posting online, oh yeah, I read it during the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So that means their services were very long, and it means that they probably didn't look in the Machzor a lot, because it's not that short a book. So they must have sat there for 5 or 6 hours and plowed through. In any event, so you're 1,000% right, and I think that that's where some of the best critiques of the book are coming. They're arguing that my characterization of what I think the fundamental thrust of American Jewish life is not as widespread as I think that it is. And that's where reasonable minds really can differ. One can have a conversation, first of all, generationally, obviously, as well, it seems to me, at least, that especially among a younger generation of American Jews, some of those, what I'm arguing, were very long time ago discomforts with the idea of Zionism are actually becoming much more prevalent, and they're much more outspoken about them than they were. It's approximately, forget exactly how many years, but I think it's approximately 70-something years between 1776 and Gettysburg. It's approximately 70-something years between Gettysburg and Auschwitz, and it's 70-something years between Auschwitz and now. In other words, it's an interesting way of kind of looking at the tables of history. Auschwitz is becoming pretty far away. It's half as long ago as the Civil War, and it's already a third as long ago, more or less, as the creation of the United States, give or take, rough and dirty. And so for a younger generation who did not, for whom Israel's existence is as natural as the rising of the sun, and for whom Israel has never really seemed fragile, and so on and so forth, my view is based on my, not statistical analyses, and obviously, as Leonard Sachs of this August University has pointed out, a collection of anecdotes does not make for data. That is definitely true. But my sense of conversations is that these viewpoints are prevalent, and I think that, or I think they're more prevalent than not. But again, this is where reasonable minds can differ, and how one sees where Israelis are depends on which part of Israeli society one lives in, and how one sees where American Jews are depends on where American Jews are. Here's what I would say, though. I think for all Israelis, in different ways, The nationalist issue in Judaism is an issue in a way that it is not for the overwhelming majority of American Jews. Similarly, the universal instinct in American Judaism, even for people who, let's say, vote Republican, even for people who are on the right of American politics and Israeli politics, that universalist instinct has sunk into a certain degree, and they take great pride in that universalist element of Israel, so that of America, and so that when something like the nation-state law or something comes up, it actually can raise for them those kinds of issues. But I think, again, if we could have a really serious conversation, and if the book engendered that conversation about how much are these characterizations correct or not, and if these explanations are not the right explanation for the conflict, what are the explanations? Some people think, no, these explanations are not the right explanations, and in fact, the conventional wisdom that you're so dismissive of is actually wise. In other words, meaning it is the conflict, and it is the rabbinate, and if Israel changed those things, the relationship would be dramatically different. I'm not convinced, obviously. If I was convinced, I would have written a different book. But again, as I said, if that's the conversation that we end up having about American Jews in Israel, that'll be a much more rich and I think a much more productive conversation than the mutually dismissive and the too often histrionic conversation that we have about the two communities now, which doesn't move us forward.
Other questions? I know there's a whole class and we welcome you. Anybody want to pose a question? Note that I cannot see you easily, so speak up or anyway. So let me ask.
I have a question.
Yeah, good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've never used my computer this way before.
All right. Would you please.
Hi. I'm Eric Alterman. I'm a graduate of the Schusterman program. And I read your book. And I found it compelling for a while, and then I felt it got a little slippery towards the end. And I would pose my question this way: why should young American Jews feel themselves attached to Israel? Israel is an increasingly ethno-religious state. Its treatment of the Palestinians is very distasteful. You might think it's justified, but it's not seen that way by liberal American Jews. The Holocaust is a very long time ago, and the states, the societies and the problems they face have very little in common. In addition to which, the current prime minister has made it clear that he couldn't care less what American Jews think. He has the support of the Christian community of the Republican Party, of which has the support of about 20% of American Jews, not mainstream, not secular American Jews. And my third point, that's part of the question, then I'll stop, is that I would argue that it may have been absolutely necessary in historical context for American Jews to support the creation of the state of Israel and the protection of the state of Israel. But there's been an enormous cost to American Jews in that the cause of Zionism has hollowed out American Jewry, and it's left it with very little foundation for non-Orthodox Jews, and it has atrophied on the vine, so to speak. And for that reason, attention should be turned inward to create a vibrant American Jewry that can survive absent this experience, which is at best once removed and no longer seems to be so vital as it was in past generations.
Okay, there's a lot in that question, so thank you for it. Thank you very much for it. There's a ton in there. Let me just take one piece of it, and I would be delighted to have a private conversation at some point because there's a lot of really great stuff in there. Some of it we agree about, some of it we disagree about, and a lot of it was just I would learn a tremendous amount from having the conversation. The one thing that I will say is that I think there's a way in which you're right, and I'm going to look at the last point of your question. I think you're right that Israel now takes up a tremendous percent of the oxygen of American Judaism. The question is, what's the cause and what's the effect? In other words, is it the case that there's not much else, as you intimated, going on in American Jewish discourse outside, let's say, Orthodoxy or outside the right wing of American Jews, the 20% that you referred to, because Zionism in Israel has kind of taken up all that oxygen? Or has Zionism become the big issue because other kinds of issues have been pushed to the side? you, I think, lean towards the former, and I think I lean towards the latter, which is to say, I think we both agree about this. If you could just take out Israel, it didn't exist as an American Jewish source of conversation, there's actually very little that would get American Jews exercised. I mean, you're not going to get people all that exercised about the question of what did or did not happen at Sinai. And you're not going to get people all exercised about, the Musar movement or the Haskalah or anything else. And even ethical issues and halachic issues are discussed much more in global terms than they are in Jewish terms. So I think there's a really interesting question here, which is, does Israel's domination of American Jewish discourse stem from its having cut the oxygen off, or has it filled a void? I think the latter, but I think your question is an important call, which is, and here I think we would both agree, that Israel can't be the main issue that American Jews talk about. American Jews need to create, recreate, reinvitalize, whatever, a rich religious, cultural, moral conversation. Israel can be a part of it, and American Jews will be in certain places on it, others will be different. But I think we both want to see a world in which there's a rich American Jewish conversation, which is going to be a part, but is certainly not the dominant piece.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Daniel Gordis for joining us. I want to thank all of you who tuned in to this webinar, and thank you very much for your support. This recording will be made available in the coming weeks. If you know people who'd like to listen and learn from Daniel Gordis but couldn't be with us. And we will be having upcoming grad seminars, which, as you know, are also simulcast to you, and we hope that you will listen to them. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon.
Take care. Thank you so much.